Sync now. So, welcome to this week's Mental Health Wednesday conversation. We have a very special guest today. Do you want to introduce who you are, what grade you're in, what homeroom you're in, and maybe let's do a fun question. Uh, what is your favorite ice cream? We'll do that.
Mm.
Um, my name is Miranda. I'm in 8th grade. I'm in UW, and I don't really have a favorite ice cream. I don't really like it.
You don't like ice cream?
Not really.
Oh, okay. Interesting.
How about a favorite flavor of cake?
I don't like cake either.
Whoa. Okay. Is there a dessert that you prefer?
Not really.
Wow. Interesting. Okay.
Do you have a favorite vegetable?
Yeah, I do.
What is it?
I like broccoli a lot.
Whoa.
All right, here we go.
Do you like it steamed or do you like it just like as is?
I like it steamed.
Oh, okay, because I know it might sound weird, but I like mine steamed and I melt like cheddar cheese over it, so that's how I
Oh
usually
yeah,
like mine.
that's good. Yeah.
Right? Right? Yeah, I like it a little salty too, so I always usually boil the broccoli and salt. Anyways, I'm getting carried away. I'm getting really hungry. I haven't had lunch yet. Sorry. So yeah, our discussion about mental health. The topic for the survey this week was about equity, and so Miss Laura started this series last week about a very big topic that is very much a part of our society. It's kind of resurfaced in a different light. So this is a very good time to talk about these matters. And I'll let you to actually do the intro, Miss Laura, if you want to talk about the survey, what you talk about at the very basic level.
Yeah, absolutely. So last week when we were talking about diversity and the differences between us, I think that we don't know how many differences there could be just between every single person. You know, the differences, just the three people right now that are talking, are immeasurable. There are so many differences between us. And I want to talk to our students about how to embrace those differences about ourselves, how to not feel bad about how we're different. But then also, when we're talking about equity, could somebody treat me differently or give me less access to things just because of who I am and what my identity is? I think that that is a reality in our world. To think that that doesn't exist might be a little bit I kind of blissful. You know, when they say ignorance is bliss, I kind of think that way. If you just want to live in a world where you think that people don't get treated differently based on who they are, that is one thing to believe, but in actuality, it is really what's happening. And whether that is you or somebody else, people are being treated differently based on their identities. It's happened through history. It's happening today. If it's not happening to you, I think that's wonderful. I don't want people to be treated differently based on their identities. But just because it's not happening to you doesn't mean it's not happening to somebody else. And so I give the example of the stereotypes, the definition of stereotype, prejudice, discrimination, and how that ultimately leads to inequity. Stereotypes are, whether I believe them or not, there is currently maybe a stereotype that, to begin, all girls like pink. That might be a stereotype. But that doesn't mean that it's true. But if I believed it, I might have prejudice. If I have prejudice, that might lead me to act differently towards people with discrimination, and that leads to inequity.
Before I ask Miranda a question, I guess I have a question for you, Miss Laura. So I know a lot of students might, or a lot of people in general might actually think the word equality is synonymous with equity. So can you elaborate on that as well?
Yeah, equality would mean that everybody's either treated fairly or given the opportunity and equal access to things. I think equality is wonderful, and that would mean that each of us are given 2 tacos from Taco Bell. That's equal. That's what's up.
If you gotta bring up food. I'm hungry right now.
I know. I'm sorry. Oh, this is a good point. So see, if we're all given 2 tacos from Taco Bell, that would be equality. But you know what? Miranda just had Taco Bell. I'm full and I don't need Taco Bell. You are hungry. I'm not even going to use my 2 tacos. I might throw them away.
No.
And that's okay. I wouldn't throw food away.
Okay.
But in terms of equity, you are hungrier than me. You might even not feel full after 2 tacos. Maybe you need more. Equity is seeing the current situation and trying to make it fair. Equally, we might all get 2 tacos, but we're all hungry on very different levels. And if you have 2 tacos, you might still be hungry. And equity looks like giving you 4 tacos, because then you'll be as full as me.
Thank you, Ms. Lara. So Miranda, I'm curious, what are some issues that as a student, you can think about prior years when you were a kid to all the way now. What are some issues that come up to your head when you talk about equity and equality? What are the ones that are most prevalent to you?
Well, I guess like it'd be like public schools and like private schools as like a student, because like sometimes private schools have more like they have more money than like public, because we go to a charter, obviously this is a charter school, and we're not in a district, I believe.
We are in a district, but we don't get our funds from the state. Yeah,
we don't get our funds from the state. While other schools, they do get their funds from the state, and obviously they can do a lot more things that we probably can't do, and they can probably get like a better education than what we have with all the money that they have, which I think is like kind of messed up, because I think like everyone should have the right to have a high education.
You bring up a very, very good, solid point. That's something that a lot of educators like Ms. Lara and myself, we talk about and we think about. That's a very important point that you bring up, because there is inequity, there is inequality in terms of like, just if you talked about money,
yes.
And then money could mean resources and other like even curriculum or the content, like even teachers, the quality of the teachers, like maybe other schools, because they have more money, I don't know, some teachers may be selfish and may want to work there more. There's a lot of things that go into just the inequity and the inequality in that realm. So I really appreciate that sentiment, because a lot of times I don't know if our students are thinking about those things, but with the charter school, it's like we're a very special, I guess, circumstances where kind of neither private nor public in some way. There's like a very like a small niche that we belong into. So thank you for bringing that up. That's a really big important point.
And when I go over diversity and equity in our last couple weeks, I didn't even name socioeconomic status, which is basically how much money you have. I didn't even name that as an identity. And so there is very much inequity in how much people are making and the access that they have to resources and opportunities. And so that is sometimes an identifier. For me, for example, I might have grown up in a lower earning economic class, meaning my parents had to work really hard and they didn't have access to a big house. We didn't have the same opportunities that other kids might have had to go to camp, things like that, or even to belong in a sport. Access to sports and being able to play sports is largely on income. And so some people really want to identify with an economic class, an economic category, and that can hugely shape people's identities and their experiences.
And I think, another point that comes up is, I'm curious, let me ask you this though, Miranda, through your grade school experience and then your middle school experience now, how often do you think you had teachers or people at your school, like the personnel at the school, that looked like you?
So before I went to Alpha, I went to Puritan, and that school definitely doesn't have as much, to put it in terms, it doesn't have as much diversity as Alpha does, because Alpha is like a school full of like Mexican people, like some African American kids, like all that, like that's really sweet. But then with Puritan, it wouldn't be like that. You see like maybe a couple, and like it kind of sucked, because that means like they talk about things, and we wouldn't necessarily relate to that, because we'd have different families, and we deal with different things in like different ways, and we'd have a different culture. And like sure, it'd be like, oh, like cultural day, like we learn about different cultures, but then like sometimes we wouldn't really necessarily fit in.
Makes sense. I remember like for my school experience, I bring that up because I don't feel like I didn't had any teachers that looked like me or even understood what it meant to be Asian American in particular. Like for me, like I don't know if you can relate, Miranda, like my parents are very much Korean and they grew up in Korean culture and then they immigrated to America. So they're kind of trying to still, I mean, my mom is still somewhat navigating through it. But she obviously sees herself as an American. And for me, I'm like, I'm between two worlds. Like, am I more Korean? Am I American? Why can't I just be in the middle? And even being in the middle sometimes became uncomfortable. And I think language is another big thing too. Like when speaking the language, there's a big emphasis on it. And I know we talked about it before in different discussions, Miss Laura, but you think about those things in the settings that we grow up in as teachers and in students. Is it equal? Is it equitable? So you think about the opportunities and specifically in terms of how you can perform as a student, but also more as a human being. So I really appreciate you thinking about those things and expressing out loud. Why do you think it's important to have that diversity, though? I'm curious, Miranda.
I think it's important to have that diversity because in the world, you meet different people. You meet all kinds of people. And if you just stay in one type of if you just stay with one type of culture for like your whole life, you probably won't know what to say to these people. Like
Yeah,
you'll
that's
probably
all you
say
know.
something. Yeah, because it's all you know and you don't know anything else. And then that's when stereotypes start clicking in because you'll hear things about other cultures and you'll think that's what's true.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Or you might think that the culture that you're in or the identity that you have is the only right way to live, or it's the only thing you know, so it has to be right. And that could really narrow the focus of what we believe are people's way of living in terms of their identity. I want to go back to actually what you were mentioning about seeing teachers that might look like you, seeing people in your community, seeing people who are successful that look like you. I think we're getting into conversations about representation and inclusion. You know, in terms of next week, we're going to be talking about how there are a lot of leaders in history, and we are just now going to have our first female vice president who is also a person of color. Inclusion and representation matters, and that starts with diversity and equity. You know, if I saw you, Mr. S, if I saw you and I said, oh, you know what, look at this guy. For some reason, I don't really want to hire him because I think that he's not going to be good at this or that. Based on just looking at you or based on your identity, that means that I'm being discriminatory. That means I'm not giving you equal or equitable opportunity to have success. Being treated differently based on your identity is unfortunately something that could happen to you, but I want our students to know about the ways that they might treat people differently, the way that they might see people who are different, because that's the only way that we can really cure, manage, or work with discrimination, is knowing what our kind of thoughts are. For example, it was very, very difficult for me to unpair or dissociate my belief that people who are older might be poor drivers. That's not fair. That's not fair, okay? That is a belief
Ouch.
that I have. I know,
Ouch.
ouch, I get it. But that's a very controversial kind of topic. Some people say, oh, we should take driver's licenses away at a certain age. And that's discriminatory. Just because you are 75 doesn't mean you are a bad driver. That's a very small example, and there are much more serious examples based on different identities, just assuming that a whole group is something, and then therefore, if we just restricted licenses to older people, that would be discriminatory. And I want people to know they might be treated differently based on their identities, or they might be treating other people differently based on their identities. And it's baseless.
Yeah, and I think a lot of situations come in my head, and it makes me think like sometimes we rush to assumptions. We assume so much right away, and a lot of it just on appearance. Sometimes situationally too, like our emotions get the best of us. But I think for me, I just can't believe just the world we live in, or the society we live in. I think the most recent example is someone looked at me and they assumed that I spoke Chinese. And
Mm,
you can't be doing stuff like that.
Mm.
In this day and age, you wouldn't expect it, but it still it exists, which is crazy. But at the same time, I think a lot of us want to call out. I think we talked about last week, but this call out culture is not healthy. Okay, sometimes we gotta be forgiving. People can make mistakes, and that's a learning opportunity for them.
yes.
So I think on both sides, we really gotta think about how do we ask those questions? What kind of questions do we ask if we're really curious instead of assuming?
Yeah.
Have a good intent, a good heart, a good mind before we ask those things. And then for me, I got to be accepting, like, okay, maybe this person just doesn't know. I'm just gonna pretend that they made a mistake. I'm gonna correct them as politely as possible. And if it doesn't go from there, then there are other measures, obviously non-violence, but there are other measures to have that discussion and that dialogue, so to educate them. And that's what we absolutely need. People are super proud of themselves, they're full of themselves, and we just got to let go of ourselves and try to understand from a different perspective and not assume. And I think a lot of times, I brought up my mom earlier, just because she doesn't speak English as well doesn't make her less American or less of a person to be able to live in this country or live just the way she wants to. That's incredibly poor to have that type of judgment. And I think that's where you see inequality, where you see inequity. We cannot rush to assumptions. And that's where that word fair, being fair, like if you were in my shoes, you think I would accept that? So we got to really think about those things and do some soul searching. That's what this country really needs at this time too. Like just some soul searching and to really exercise that you are a human being and you have a heart.
Yeah. I'd love to maybe have a corrective experience around that, Mr. S. So you do not speak Chinese because you are not Chinese, you are Korean. And, you've shared that before, so I'm lucky that I know that about you and I don't make an assumption. Instead of me saying, and maybe instead of me, if I spoke Chinese and I just came up to you and started speaking Chinese, instead, what I could do is maybe ask, by any chance, do you speak Chinese? Or I could say, hey, what language do you speak? That is even a bigger question that has no assumptions, that you just might need to use to get to know people. These are difficult questions to learn how to formulate because we have to work against all the stereotypes we've had. If I just looked at you and was stereotypical and said, oh, he's some kind of Asian, maybe he speaks Chinese, I have to work against that. I have to really be mindful and have a bigger question about people's lifestyle so that I'm not specific and reading into stereotypes. So I can say, do you speak any other languages besides English? And that could be a better topic for how to go about that. What do you think, Miranda?
Oh, I think like 100%. Like that's what you should always ask someone instead of just assuming things. You should always just ask them like, hey, what languages do you speak? And like if you like, because you just assuming, it's not nice. It really isn't. Because if you just assume and you start talking about like these other things like stereotypes and something like that, the person like may think like, oh, this is what people see me as, like this is what the world sees me as. Like that could really hurt a person. It really could. It could change a person. Like just a little negativity could actually change them. And I feel like just being respectful and responsible with your words is just as important.
Thank you for that. And I want to clarify that there is nothing wrong with speaking Chinese or being Chinese. It's about being misrepresented, misassociated, misidentified. It doesn't have to be a negative thing that you're associated with. Somebody, a lot of times people say, oh, you speak Spanish, right, Miss Lar? I'm actually not, I don't speak Spanish and I'm not of any kind of Latinx descent. I'm Filipino. So it's okay. There's nothing wrong with being associated with being Hispanic or people assuming that, but it could hurt if I'm misrepresented, misidentified, because my identity is Filipino, and I want people to know that, and I want people to know that about me and see me that way. So I appreciate you saying that, Miranda.
And I think
That
that's another good point that we talked about, I think last week or the prior time, but just because we are something ethnically doesn't mean we automatically assume that we're fluent in that language. So if I'm Korean, everyone shouldn't expect that I'm going to be completely fluent. So it's kind of, it's yeah, there's a lot of different give and take in there. So I think it's just like navigating through, again, like I said earlier, carefully, treading softly and trying to be mindful of how they identify themselves. But at the same time, the flip side of things, now I'm going to mix it up a little bit more. When somebody does speak your native tongue, to be honest, when I have friends that are not of Korean descent, especially, and they speak Korean fluently, I'm like, yo, what's up with that? That's awesome. So I'm curious, Miranda. So if your classmates also spoke a different language aside from English and you were also fluent, wouldn't that be pretty cool? What do you think?
Yeah, it would be pretty cool because then we can just like embrace our culture in a way instead of just like, because I'm Mexican American. A lot of my classmates, they obviously speak Spanish and all that. I'm not fluent in it, so I'm like, I'll mess it up a little bit, but I can still talk, sort of, and I'll speak with them in Spanish. But then all my chunks will be a little like weird, and they'll tell me, they'll be like, oh, this is how you say it.
Yeah.
And I think that's really sweet because that's just them helping you embrace your culture.
Yep. Building each other up.
Yeah, that like showing you the like, this is how you speak this language. Like, and if people don't speak your language, you can try to help them. As like you can, because honestly, cultures like should be a really big part of just our everyday lives.
Mhm.
It really should.
And that's why I think language is one of those gateways. I brought up food in a prior discussion. Food is a gateway to kind of better understand culture because there's influences, there's ingredients that are native to, you know, where you grew up and whatnot. So that is like a huge gateway. And then language is another gateway because sometimes like when I'm trying to explain something in English to my mom, there's a better way in Korean that actually expresses that thought or that feeling, whatever it may be, a whole lot better. So it gives us actually versatility, and that's what we actually, you know, briefly talked about it, I think last year. But people assume just because we only speak a different language aside from English that we're not as smart as well. That's another thing, and that's a poor assumption as well. Like in actuality, you can speak more than one language. That's actually pretty intellectual right there. To be able to do that, to express everything you can in another language, is a huge skill set, and like you have more knowledge that way because you have multiple ways to communicate what you're trying to say, how you feel, how you see things, how you touch things, so on and so forth. So I think, yeah, you mentioned some very good points that I think, you know, we should have equal opportunity, equitable opportunity as human beings, not just as students, because we're always going to be learners, I feel like, as human beings. That's just my opinion. But I think we're going to always be learning, and just to have that level of just like flexibility and adaptability and just being versatile and speaking other languages, I think would be so powerful if as a country we decided to embrace each other through whether it be language, food, so on and so forth.
I think, you know, a note to leave on is that we do want to challenge these stereotypes. We don't want to apply them or assume things about anybody. Right now, you know, there are stereotypes that we cannot avoid. They are going to happen. They are misconceptions, and it is your choice as to whether you would like to believe them and have them inform how you treat people. As of right now, I'm doing my best to break stereotypes, to not assume anything is related to anybody's identity. Just because somebody is a boy doesn't mean that I go ahead and give them blue clothing. You know, that's weird. That color is gendered. You know, like it's so interesting. We want to break some stereotypes, and we want to just have flexibility in the way that we see people and see things. just because somebody is Mexican does not mean, I actually saw this in one of our surveys, just because someone is Mexican does not mean that they or their parents are immigrants or illegal immigrants. We need to break down these assumptions, because if I just look at someone and assume that based on that stereotype, they belong to that, I might treat them differently, and that's not okay. We want to change our assumptions with everybody. So I would want to challenge people to do that. Miranda, do you have any final thoughts on breaking identity or breaking stereotypes?
No, not really. I feel like we summed it up pretty well.
Chill. What about you, S?
Yeah, I agree. We talked about a lot of great things. Again, when you think about equity and equality, the most basic word that comes out that was mentioned in the video was, is it fair?
Yeah.
So that's what it comes down to. Is it fair? Yes or no? And it's literally one or the other. There's no in between. It's fair or not fair. And
Right.
so I think we've got to ask that question and then reel it back and really think why it's not fair, why it is fair, and provide sound rationale to those arguments. So I think that's incredibly important. We really got to take it back and, again, dissolve our pride and really be open-minded with one another. And I know, Miranda, you talked about like kind of being narrow-minded, like you're only in this corner, so you belong in that corner because of this and this. That's not, it's not safe. It's not good for us in terms of mental health and so much more. And unfortunately, in some cases, physically, where there's violence involved. And so we got to stop that vicious cycle. These are very big topics. I know a lot of parents and students watch these videos. Please make sure if you have any questions or comments, feel free to comment on our Instagram account or our Facebook account. These videos are also posted on our YouTube channel. So please make sure to search Alpha Blanca Alvarado, and all of those 3 channels are available with these discussions. Please feel free to, again, reach out to any of your teachers or staff, and Miss Laura, wonderful counselor. Miranda, thank you so much for joining us. This has been a very solid discussion. You don't know how much we appreciate you. Sometimes Miss Laura might get bored of me, and it's just us two. I'm just kidding, Miss Laura, but
Yeah.
we really appreciate you providing your perspective and being open.
Absolutely.
All right, well, thank you, everybody. Take care. We'll see you next week.
Take care, everyone. See ya.